All right, let's resume. And we'll talk about sector balances next. And this one it's a little more complicated than the stuff we usually talk about, simply because there are several pieces to it, and you have to kind of think about them together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it and sort of in three different ways tell you the same thing. And there is a quiz at the end. And so I think the quiz is actually kind of fun, economics quiz is being fun, but it forces you to think about what you've learned. And so as we go through, we'll go through it slow. And of course, you can ask questions at any time, jump in. But the reason we teach it every couple of years is two reasons. One is it gives you a really interesting understanding of how the economy works. It's a kind of a look inside the big machine of the economy and try to understand what's going on. It's also part of the influencing the thinking of MMT type economists, modern monetary theorist folks think about these balances, and they use the kind of lingo that you see in here. So we covered every now and then. I think people got it a couple of years ago, but it was one of those where if you're not going to look at it regularly, you're probably not going to remember it. So we'll go through it, and here we go. Well, we'll go as soon as I can figure out how to do it. Here we go. All right. So there are three sectors in this model, and the first sector is one you're familiar with, is the government sector. This red line, is simply the federal budget deficit as a percent of GDP. And everything I'm going to be talking about when I teach this tonight is going to be the percent of GDP. I'm not going to use dollars. But if you like dollars, just remember that 1% of GDP is about $200 billion. So when the budget deficit shows here in 2020 at 15% of GDP, that's times two is $3 trillion. 15% of GDP, it's 15 times 2, 3. It comes out about $3 trillion. So 15 times 200 billion is $3 trillion. That's the deficit in 2020. But the government sector is the first big sector. In theory, you use the entire government, meaning you use the federal government and you also use the state and local government. But the way CBO does it, they just use the federal government because that's a much more recognizable number. And the local government tends to be a small number that isn't as easily measured for their purposes. So the numbers I'll be using this is how the CBO does it. So the idea here is that the language that the economists use, they use T minus G. T is tax revenue, G is government spending. And so the government balance is T minus G. So we have much bigger spending than tax revenue, and so that's why this is a negative number. G is much bigger than T. And when you think about the government sector balance, when it's negative like this, big deficit, they're adding to debt, meaning the government's net worth is getting more negative. It's a net borrower. Its net worth is decreasing. All right? And each of these sectors, as we do that, a sector that is in deficit is borrowing, and a sector that is in surplus is lending. The sector that's in deficit has a net worth that is falling, and the sector with a surplus is net worth is increasing. Now, the next one is the foreign sector, and this is really the flip side of the trade deficit, approximately. So the U.S., as you know, we import a lot more than we export, so we have a trade deficit. The way this model defines the foreign sector is from the foreigner's perspective, the rest of the world taken in aggregate. So if the U.S. has a trade deficit, meaning we have a trade deficit with the rest of the world together, if you add up all the countries, has a trade surplus with the United States. So our trade deficit is their trade surplus, and that's what shows up here. The foreign sector is in surplus because the U.S. has a trade deficit. And so you can think about it as technically the trade deficit is what you usually hear about imports and exports. We have a lot more imports than exports. We have a trade deficit. But the way this is measured is using what's called the current account, which is a very similar concept, almost the same number, but there's also financial flows due to international investment. So for example, if foreigners own a lot of U.S. stocks and bonds, they are getting dividends that are being sent overseas. I remember hearing about a third of the U.S. stock market is owned by foreigners. So the money is going overseas for dividends, and I believe capital gains would do that too. On the other side of that, the U.S. people also have investments in foreign countries, and they give us dividends and interest from that. So foreign bonds, foreign stocks, they're getting that. That altogether is what's called the current account. But if you're having trouble with that idea, just remember that the trade deficit is almost, the trade balance is the overwhelmingly larger part of the current account. And the foreign sector is, we're seeing this from the foreign sector side. So this is like the mirror image of the trade deficit. I could draw the trade deficit on here, would be the mirror image of that line below zero. It's about 3% of GDP. And you can see if you look for the last 10 years or so, it's been around that same amount. That line, as you go through here, from 2009 to present, it has been around 3% of GDP. We've been running a 3% of GDP trade deficit or current account deficit from the foreigner's view. They're above that. Same idea here that I mentioned earlier. If the foreign sector is in surplus, they are adding to their net worth. They are lending to us. We are borrowing to finance our trade deficit. Think of when we're buying more imports than we're exporting, it's kind of like the vendor is financing our extra purchases. Our trading partners are saying, we'll lend you the money so you can buy our stuff. And so they get financial assets for that. They are lending and we are borrowing. And the domestic private sector is the last of the three. And this is savings minus investment, so S minus I. This is savings by households and investments by businesses. So think of it as in a well-functioning economy, the households are putting money in the bank, they're saving it. And when I say bank, I mean the financial system at large. And then businesses borrow that money and they invest it. They buy property, plant, and equipment, or they do mergers, or they do whatever. They are borrowing the money from the financial system and investing it. And this is what the domestic private sector savings minus investment is since 1999. And you can see lately, because of what's going on with the coronavirus, you've probably heard anecdotes about how tons of this government stimulus, the $1.9 trillion Biden plan, and also not so much with that because that's recent, but the CARES Act, that a lot of the CARES Act was saved, that people didn't spend it. And that's part of why you see that green line spiking upward. There's a ton of saving happening because the government is essentially giving the money to households, but they're not giving it to businesses, and the businesses are not investing it as much. And so this green line has jumped upward. And there was a similar jump upward in the Great Recession for very different reasons. And when we'll talk about the policy implications of this, now you're saying, okay, Dave, you show me these three lines. What do you mean? Well, what's the framework? Well, here it is. These are the three lines all drawn on the same graph, percent of GDP. You kind of notice that the red line and the green line look kind of like mirror images of each other, right? To a certain extent. And then the blue line is in there as well, the foreign sector. But if you look at the numbers for 2020, 12 and 3 and minus 15, what do they add up to? 0. Always. They must add to 0 every year. It's an identity, just like the accounting equation where you say assets is the sum of liabilities and equity. They must be the same. That is, if you are doing your accounting correctly, assets equal liabilities plus equity, that balance is always true. The way these sectoral balances are defined, the way each of these red lines, each of these three lines is defined, is so that they add to 0. That is how they are designed. In the most simple terms, if one sector is in deficit, the other sector, if you were in a two-sector world, if one sector is in deficit, the other sector must be in surplus. It's simply, if one person is lending, the other person is borrowing. You can't have two lenders because there's nobody borrowing, and you can't have two borrowers because there's nobody lending. Somebody's got to be lending and somebody's got to be borrowing. And that is the kind of the insight of this. Now, what drives a sector upward or downward? You can't tell that by just looking at the number. You need to know what's going on. And so I explained a little bit earlier why this green line is spiking up here in 2020, because mainly of the CARES Act giving an enormous amount of money to individuals in the private sector, like you and me, people on the phone, are getting checks and in many cases saving them. And so that savings minus investment is causing that line to go up. But what's happening? Well, what drove that? It was the government choosing to do that. The government passed the CARES Act and said, we're going to print an enormous amount of money electronically and inject it right into the private sector. And people are saying, thank you very much. I'm going to put it in the bank. And that's what's happening fundamentally here. Back in 2008, the situation was a little more complicated, where in that case, households had been borrowing for a long time, and you had the housing bubble, and the bubble burst, and people suddenly stopped borrowing, and they suddenly started saving, or in some cases it was forced on them because their house was taken away with foreclosure. Suddenly their net worth went up. And so the green line, they stopped borrowing, and they started either saving or doing nothing, and that green line jumped upward. Entirely different reason. Back in 2008 and 9, the government budget deficit was the tail, not the dog. The government budget deficit, because all of a sudden the private sector stopped borrowing and spending and buying houses, they went the opposite direction. They started paying down debt. They started foreclosing. The government went deeply into debt, and it wasn't because of the Obama stimulus, which was just a couple $100 billion a year. It was tax revenues fell enormously because the economy slowed down, and automatic stabilizers, meaning unemployment insurance, food stamps, and other automatic spending, jumped enormously. So it wasn't a policy choice that drove this big difference here in green and red, which is very different from what happened here. So in 2020, the government drove this giant domestic private sector surplus by passing the CARES Act, a piece of legislation, and all that $2 trillion was in 1 year, 2020. Back here, what you had was the private sector dramatically changed its behavior on a dime, and the government simply reacted. It had to. As much abuse as Obama took, because the green line jumped up, the red line had to go down. It was no policy choice. It's simply math. It's simply the equation had to balance. And you say, there's no way, Dave, it can't just balance like that. Well, the way it balances, as I mentioned, tax revenue plummeted, and the automatic stabilizer spending jumped because people didn't have jobs, and you saw this pattern. So two enormous spikes where the red line and the green line diverged, but entirely different reasons. One driven by the government, the current one. So the dog is the government, and the tail is the dog in 2020. Back here, the dog was the private sector, and the tail was the government. Let me pause there for a second. Have I totally blown your minds, or are you still with me?
David, I have a question.
Talk to me. Yes, please.
That green line, which you say is savings, could that green line not only be savings, but could it be a change? In other words, if somebody got a $2,000 government check and they paid off debt, is that part of that calculation, or is this pure savings in a bank?
That would be savings.
Okay.
Paying off debt would count as savings.
Okay, good. I got it.
All right. Yes. And the math, the way this works is it's savings. You're right. It's savings minus investment. So what's happening here is people are saving enormous amounts of money. The government basically gave it to them, created the money and gave it to them. And they did not, the businesses have not changed their behavior dramatically. They're not spending, they're not investing tons more or less than they were. They're pretty static. So that's why this number has jumped suddenly, as the government said, we'll go deeply into deficit and give you the money. But it was the government that made the call, meaning if the government didn't do this, you may have actually seen something similar happen, but it would have been the other way, where the private sector just shut down. It wouldn't be that people got money and saved it. It would have been that the private sector would have seen sort of a rehash of 2008, where you might have seen this divergence, but it would have been for an entirely different reason, which was the government is facing a crisis where the economy is cratering. And what happened here is the economy, even though it slowed down and there were all these jobs lost, the government injected all this money to where people weren't in a lot worse shape than they were. There are some people that are in worse shape, but there's some people that really weathered the storm incredibly well. And it's so, how would I put it? It was again, just to say it, it was a government choice to spend $2.1 trillion, and that helped, prevent sort of a rehash of 2008, which would have been a situation where the economy was in even worse shape. And that drove the red line down because of less tax revenue, much higher automatic stabilizer spending. All right, so when you look at the three of these things together, the domestic private sector and the foreign sector are in surplus right now. Let's look at 2020. They're above zero, and the government sector is down, and they add up to zero. And there's some bullets down here at the bottom. Again, I'll say it again. A sector that's in surplus is lending or adding to its financial assets. Its net worth is increasing. So the domestic private sector, they've taken this big injection from the government, and they're buying stuff. They're buying stocks. They're buying bonds. They're paying off debt. They've got it sitting in their savings account. The private sector's net worth has been going up because the government gave them the money. On the other hand, the government, the next bullet, sector in deficit is borrowing or adding to its financial liabilities. Its net worth is decreasing. The government has issued an enormous amount of bonds. It's lending. I'm sorry, it is borrowing the money and using that. So that's the third bullet. The government's deficit means the government is borrowing. The national debt liabilities are increasing. So the government sector is going further into debt. I should just point out, you may have already made this connection, but each of these points in time in a year, think of it kind of like we think about the government budget deficit, meaning it's tax revenue minus spending in a given year. The national debt is the sum of many years. What I'm showing you here is like the annual deficit calculation, right? Like I showed you here, I was just showing you the annual deficit as a percent of GDP. Think of this as a collection of annual observations like you would for the budget deficit, the way Carl showed it earlier of how much it is in a given year. We're not talking about, don't think about the idea of national debt as being on this graph, right? I'm showing you the government budget deficit each year. These things add up over time. I'm not showing you the amount of the private sector's net worth, which is 100 and something trillion. I'm just showing you the changes in a given year, the deficits or surpluses in a given year. In the private sector, now here's where this gets interesting. I shouldn't say I think this is completely fascinating throughout, but where it gets interesting is that an MMT economist will tell you, and I've got a source cited coming up here, if you have the green line negative, like it's been here, like it was in 99 all the way through 2008, what that means is that the private sector is borrowing. It's a net borrower. Its net worth is taking a hit. And if your private sector is borrowing and is taking a hit like that, its net worth is getting hurt, the economists, not just MMT economists, but others are like, that's a dangerous position to be in because eventually the private sector just can't keep borrowing the way a government can. The private sector eventually hits a wall. And it did in 2008 with the crisis, 2007, 2008. The housing market, I think, peaked in 05 or 06, but the bubble burst and then the financial market started to collapse in 07, and then the recession was late in 08. If you have your private sector in deficit, you are risking a calamity. And we haven't seen a point right now where the federal government is risking calamity by being in deficit. If you think about it, and Carl can correct me here, 1969 and then 1998 to 2001 are the only years, going back to 69, that we've had a federal government surplus. Every other year was a deficit, and we have not had a government debt crisis. Nobody has said the government can't pay its debts, other than the Republicans saying, creating a phony debt ceiling crisis. Take out the debt ceiling, nobody's worried about the government's ability to pay its bonds. But what happened here is you had economists starting to warn in the early 2000s, and I'll share one of those with you, saying if you continue to run a private sector deficit, you will have a calamity happen. And they did it using this framework. The economist's name is Wynne Godley. He was a pretty high up official in the British government in their sort of controller's office and bank, and a professor, and he shared that. He said, he wrote a lot about it, saying if you guys keep doing this, it will explode just because you cannot sustain a private sector deficit. And the reason that's important is because most of us think we want the government, the federal government, to be in surplus. We want the federal government to be running a budget surplus. Clinton got a lot of praise for doing that. And if you look at this here, in 99, the government, right in here, 99, because I don't go back to 98, but 98, 99, 2000, 2001, the government was actually in surplus. You had the foreign sector, a pretty high trade, we had a trade deficit, so the foreign sector was also in surplus. So by definition, the green line had to be negative. This is not a sustainable pattern. In other words, this what's going on here, 99 to 2007, was something that economist Wynne Godley was saying, you are in danger if you do that. So the conclusion you come to when you look at this is, all right, if our foreign sector, if we're going to run a trade deficit that's 3% of GDP, and we want the domestic private sector to also be in surplus, so let's say we want the domestic private sector to be at least 1, like in here, and the foreign sector is at 3, we're going to have to run a 4% of GDP budget deficit in order for that to happen. Because then they always have to add to 0, right? So if you've got a foreign sector plus 3, let's say domestic sector plus 1, you're going to have a government sector minus 4 so that the equality is 0. Does that make sense? Do you follow that math? So where I'm headed with this is, to say it very simply, if you run a trade deficit of a certain amount, your budget deficit has to be bigger than that. Stated in these terms, if the foreign sector, using math, if the foreign sector is 3%, meaning we have a 3% of GDP trade deficit, foreign sector is in surplus, we've got to run at least a 3% of GDP deficit. Otherwise, we are draining money out of the private sector. Do you guys follow that? Does that make sense? So the goal of a budget surplus is not the right goal. In the United States, the goal is you want your budget deficit to be as big as your foreign sector surplus, because you do not want to drain money out of the private sector for any period of time.
I understand that's what that particular economist was saying. I need to think about that a lot before I see whether or not I agree with him. Because when I look back at, real GDP growth in 99 and 2000, over 4%, almost 5% in 99, it didn't look like the private sector was really being hurt badly in those years.
Right. And I think you'll see the paper from Wynne Godley, I think his view is you don't want to sustain it. You don't want to have it happen for an extended period of time. And as long as households could borrow, and I think I just saw a note from Lori, remember this was the build-up to the housing bubble, right? So the early 2000s were when people were borrowing like crazy. It really accelerated around 2003. But that's where the subprime lending jumped dramatically. But sort of that 2003 to 2007, households were going crazy, borrowing and spending. And it crashed in 2008. From 2009 to 2012, households were actually paying down debt for the first time since the records are kept in Fred, which is 1950s. Almost always, households are borrowing and spending to boost the economy. But for those 4 years, 2009 to 12, households actually had their debt level drop. And that is a very rare thing. And you can see it here with these big, the big return into surplus that we had. Households were paying off their debt or saving, either one. But here they were doing the opposite. They were borrowing like crazy, and it built a housing bubble. So a lot of this, remember I mentioned this idea of these are annual observations, kind of like a deficit concept. You're watching the deficit or surplus each year. They add up. So this green line being negative, 5% of GDP adding up, you're looking at a lot of debt being added in the private sector, and eventually they just hit a wall. Nobody would lend to them anymore. Nobody would give them the money. The bank said we can't lend anymore. The housing prices are tanking, and we can't use that as collateral.
David?
Question? I heard a voice. Go ahead.
This is Mark.
Yep.
In 98, 99, you had a hot economy. There was a lot of mortgage borrowing, and you also had a lot of margin borrowing for the .com things going on. So that was not just individual. That was also that margin borrowing was also hedge funds. So that borrowing there was real.
Okay. Let me keep going, and I'll keep showing you this graph. And as we're analyzing different periods of time, we can look at it. But what it says is that your goal should not be just, and not everybody can be in surplus at the same time, and because these have to add to zero. You can't have everybody at 3% of GDP positive. You can't. It doesn't work. That's just impossible. So you have to make a trade-off as a policymaker. If I want, my domestic private sector to be in surplus, and I'm going to run a trade deficit, meaning a foreign sector surplus, I need to have a government deficit. If your goal is to get the government back to balance, meaning you want to be back here, and you want your private sector to be positive, you have to run a trade. The U.S. would have to run a trade surplus, meaning the foreign sector would have to be in debt. And Germany has an economy like that, where Germany's got a trade surplus with the rest of the world, so their blue line is negative, and that allows them to have a much better balanced budget situation. We'll talk in a little bit about when President Trump decided he wanted to cut taxes and expand the government budget deficit, but also reduce that foreign sector surplus, meaning run a smaller trade deficit. Those goals were not compatible, meaning if the red line is going to move away from zero, the sum of your foreign sector and your domestic private sector, that blue and green line have to offset. They have to move up to offset it, or at least one of them has to move to offset it. It's very difficult if you inject money into the private sector, meaning you cut taxes, especially for rich people. They're going to buy Beamers. They're going to buy Mercedes. So you can't, his goal of, cutting taxes, which increases the budget deficit, and cutting that foreign sector surplus, meaning cutting the trade deficit, lowering that foreign sector surplus, those were not compatible. So you'll see this framework teaches you these things these are, someone that announces prominently goals that are not compatible. If people's literacy is there, the journalists will say, that doesn't make any sense. And some of them did. These things are not compatible. What are you talking about? But also this idea that, we don't want a government that is in surplus because we'll get ourselves into trouble.
These numbers are even wilder when you look at the Great Depression.
Okay, I have not, but that would not shock me. I bet. Now, what would you have seen then? Massive.
Well, they were borrowing like crazy.
Yeah. Oh, leading up to it. Yeah. Yeah.
You can think about it this way. Every dollar parked in a bond, every dollar parked in a stock had to come from somewhere. What is the only source for a dollar?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. It has to.
Yep.
It either came from Uncle Sam or it came from the banking industry. Those are the only two places.
Yep. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that too. Yep. Go ahead.
So how does Bitcoin play into the current scheme of things, since it is another form of currency? It actually just was the reverse of what you just said. Traditionally,
except it's not currency.
Well, I actually don't know what it is, but that's a good point.
That would be a good subject for one of our meetings, is a Bitcoin discussion, because I don't know enough about it either, and that would force me to study it. So you've given us a topic. What I would say, though, for thinking about this is it's not being issued by a government entity, right, Bill? It's like an investment alternative. It's like a stock. You can buy it like you would a bond or a stock. So it's like gold. You can buy it. So I would think of it as it's part of the domestic private sector savings. Like they could have bought a bond, they could have bought a stock, they could buy a Bitcoin. They could buy a collectible. I've got a Star Wars toy over my shoulder that's from vintage 1980. I mean, you can buy collectibles. I mean, whatever your store of value is that you want to buy, but it is not a government issued currency. It is not part of the government budget deficit.
Sure, but what if I dig up in my backyard and I find some gold or silver? That's not issued by the government, et cetera, et cetera. Does that not come into this the same kind of way?
I don't know if that was not part of the gold reserves that the government is aware of, like if it's not, but if it's on their list and it's just been lost for a long time and you dig it up, I don't know if that matters. I don't know.
Well, maybe if I dig it up in a mine even, just to go on that.
Right.
We're
now,
not
that
on
would
the
be
gold
different.
standard.
Pan for it.
That would be different. That still wouldn't be a government issue thing. It would be another investment thing like a bond or a stock, I believe. All right, let me keep going. This, just in case you don't believe me, you think I'm lying about the numbers always balancing, these are the numbers. They always add to zero. And you can just see the equation there with a little bit of a spelling. It's like foreign imports minus exports. Government is revenue minus spending. Private is savings minus investment. So if you're positive, if those numbers are positive, that's a surplus. And if they're negative, it's a deficit. And notice when I do foreign, if you're familiar with the sort of the trade deficit calculation, it's usually X minus M. Net exports is what you see in the GDP calculation. That's why I've always told you that if you view it from the foreigner's perspective, it's from the opposite side of the coin. So the M and the X are reversed here. They're M minus X. Normally when we do the U.S. trade deficit, it's, we do the math X minus M, and M is much bigger, so it's a negative number. This is another way of thinking about the same idea, and it's just laid out in this format because I wanted you to see the flows a little bit. When the government is spending, it's injecting money into the private sector. And taxes are like taking it out. They're taking the money out of the private sector here. And likewise, the foreign sector, the domestic, sort of think of it as the domestic private economy, is either sending out money for imports and it's getting money back for exports. And I also mentioned that idea of the current account or the investment income. So there's kind of like the government, you think of it as the private sector sort of sitting there in the middle. The government is either injecting money or taking it out. And then the foreign sector is either taking money or giving it back. If we're exporting to them, they're paying us. And if we are importing from them, we are paying them. And that's how the math works, kind of in another way of looking at it. The way I want to explain it, though, is, and this is where the MMT economists are trying to explain it, is the government is spending money. When the government is spending money and injecting it into the private sector, that makes people like us in the private sector happy. We don't want to pay tons and tons of taxes. If the government's running a surplus, it's draining money out. The taxes are bigger than the spending. The government is taking money net out of the private sector. Likewise, if you have a trade deficit, meaning the foreign sector is in surplus, they're draining money out. And so when I said earlier, you want the government budget deficit to be bigger than the trade deficit, what I'm essentially saying is, if the government is should be injecting as much money into the private sector as the foreign sector is taken out. And I say it as taking it out, but people obviously, people buy a Beamer voluntarily. But still, we are importing a lot more than we're exporting because we're a rich country, and a lot of the rest of the world appreciates that because it stimulates their exports. They're happy to be in a surplus situation like Germany. So if you think about it as this flow of money, then you don't want to be draining the domestic private sector for very long. That's where this insight is so valuable of, okay, do I really want to run a government surplus for any extended period of time if that forces the green line negative? And the answer to that would be, from Wynne Godley and others, is you don't want to do that because then you run into, if the private sector's borrowing for a long period of time, it's going to get into trouble. It will hit a wall that the government may never hit. So I bring up, and we've talked through a lot of this already. I mentioned I was going to do this in a repetitive way because this is complicated. Trying to understand, keep all three of these ideas in your head at the same time can get rough. And again, you have this material, you can study it at your leisure. You also have the sources here. And this is where I've cited the Wynne Godley work, which is, once you've kind of gone through this lecture for me, I think you're going to be comfortable reading what he's done. But those two essays from him in June of 2005 and April 2005 are saying, because he was looking at this pattern and saying, there's no way that the U.S. economy can sustain a huge foreign surplus and a relatively tame budget deficit without draining a lot of money out of the private sector, and that's bad. And he said that is unsustainable. You will run into a wall. And so what I've written over here is kind of a summary of what was going on in those different time periods. And we've talked about it already, but I'll repeat it a little bit. In the pre-crisis, this first paragraph over here, if you're running a foreign surplus, that's the blue line, larger than the government budget deficit, which in this case was actually a surplus, the private sector must also be running a deficit, that's the green line, adding financial liabilities or losing net worth. And according to Wynne Godley, that's a risky and unsustainable thing. And we ran into a crisis in 2008. And he didn't know when it would happen. He just said, based on this sectoral framework, you will run into grief. And he'd been saying that for a long time. It wasn't just, these were more recent essays. He's been into this area for a while. And by the way, this math is not a controversial, his conclusion, like Carl said, can be controversial. His saying that it's bad to run a private sector surplus is an opinion or a judgment call that he makes. The math that these three sectors must balance is not controversial. That is standard economics. That is how these figures are defined in the literature. So there's nothing what I would call controversial about these graphs. But the interpretation of them is certainly a judgment call. Now, the 2008 to 2009 the government deficit was the tail, not the dog. The private sector could no longer borrow and went into crisis. The federal government did not change its policies that dramatically. You didn't see, the Obama stimulus was a couple $100 billion a year for 4 years, the $800 billion. Compare that to what we just did with the CARES Act, which was $2 trillion in 1 year, followed up by $900 billion in December. Okay, and remember those were in a fiscal year, both of them. So we added a massive amount of stimulus in 1 year, and what drove this line through the roof, which is this 2020 paragraph down there that I mentioned. Now, the other question is, was 2014 to 2017 kind of your Goldilocks period? You had a moderate budget deficit. The trade deficit had come down a little bit. The foreign surplus was down a little bit. And you had positive private sector surplus. And I would argue that, yes, that's what you want. Meaning if you're a policymaker, this is what you want. You want things to look like this. Or if you're Germany, for the U.S., this is optimal for the U.S. is this kind of range in here. If you could design an economy from scratch, you would probably design it like Germany's, where the blue line for Germany is actually negative. It's down here. They have a trade surplus, so they have a foreign sector deficit. And therefore, they can run a smaller government budget deficit or even a surplus. So if you could design it from scratch, yeah, you'd be like Germany. But for the U.S., what's optimal? Just make sure that you do not drain the private sector for any period of time, and that can inform your policy making significantly. And that's where this graph is so useful. I think it's one of the most important graphics in the literature, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. There's a few. The chief economist for Goldman Sachs actually shares this graph periodically and he says, this is one of the most important ways that I think about what government should be doing and which governments are running their economy well. He thinks of it almost like an EKG for an economy. So there are some pretty prominent people that are watching these numbers. And the Congressional Budget Office did cover it, but they don't get into it every year. They did it in 2018, and I cited that in a couple different places. They did it in their August 2018 update. And here's where they use this. Hopefully you can all see that. This is their language talking about kind of that early 2000 period. And they say in that first paragraph, the unique pattern in the balances of the early years of this century reflected increased borrowing by households and businesses that later proved to be unsustainable. Starting with the recession, both the federal government and U.S. domestic private sector were net borrowers. And this is the 2001 recession, so we're in here. And then this borrowing was funded by foreign investors. They were lending to us, right? And this trade deficit, our trade deficit, their surplus kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, hit 6% of GDP, which was a record for the United States. That's a very big number. And that was the record in 2006. Following the recession, private sector drastically cut its borrowing while the federal government borrowing dramatically increased, but it had to. The government didn't make that call. They were forced into it. It wasn't because they did a CARES Act. It was, tax revenue cratered, and the spending on automatic stabilizers went up by a couple of GDP. And now, and here it is, the current account deficit fell to 3%. And now it's been pretty much averaging 2.7. And when I say trade deficit, they use the word current account. Remember, they're very similar numbers. You just have the current account technically takes in payments to investors for their income from investments. So If you see current account deficit, if it helps you, just say trade deficit in your mind. Current account current account deficit, trade deficit. Current account surplus would be a trade surplus. All right. Here's the quiz. And so let's look at these scenarios. So based on this equation, and I'd like people on the phone to answer this because you've been hearing from me for a while now. So somebody on the call, just as we go through this, grab it. I'll just say the scenario, and then you can just say what's the answer. So in scenario A, if two sectors are in deficit, doesn't matter which two actually, what does the other one have to be?
Surplus.
Must be in surplus, absolutely. Scenario B, if two sectors are in surplus, what does the other one have to be? Yeah, it has to be negative. It has to be in deficit. If the government is, and I'm using GDP here, so if the government is running a 4% of GDP deficit, the private sector is running a 1% of GDP surplus, what must the foreign sector be doing?
3%.
Plus 3.
3% positive, right? They have to add to zero every time. And the same for these remaining scenarios. So D, if it's 2 minus 1, what's the foreign?
1%.
Minus 1.
Minus 1.
They have to add to zero. So the foreign will have a surplus. Oh, sorry, will be in deficit. 2 minus 1 minus 1. How about scenario E? 1 and minus 3, what does that private sector have to be?
Minus 2.
Plus 2.
Plus 2. Plus 2, so they add to zero.
No.
They must add to zero. So plus 1, plus 2, minus 3. Scenario F, if you have a minus 1 and a 1, what must the private be?
0?
0. That must be 0. That's right. Good. You guys are getting this. If the in government in G here, don't confuse G with that. If the private's minus 1, the foreign is plus 3. What's the government?
Minus 2.
Yes, 2.
Minus 2.
Minus 2.
Yeah.
Minus
Right.
2. Minus 2.
Correct. H, we've got private at 1, foreign at minus 2. What's government?
Minus 1.
Plus 1.
Plus 1.
Plus 1. Must be plus 1 because plus 1, 1, and minus 2. They add to 0. And the last one is a trick question. If one sector is in deficit, what does that tell you about the other? Does that tell you anything about the other sectors individually? Do you know where they are individually?
No.
You don't. But
No.
you know where they are in aggregate. Where must the private and the foreign together be?
Surplus.
If the government,
Surplus?
they must be in surplus. That's right. And here are the quiz answers. So you have them. If you want to quiz yourself at home, you have the answers there so you can remember. Now, again, getting back to the policy question, and I apologize for being repetitive, but I want to make sure because one of these, hopefully one of the ways I'm explaining this will click. If you had a choice, and this is kind of Germany-like, you would probably want to be at E. Because you've got, in this case, Germany's got a trade surplus, so they have a foreign sector. The foreign sectors are in deficit to them. Everybody else net has a trade deficit if Germany's in trade surplus. That allows them to run both a government surplus and a private sector surplus. The 1, the 2, both surpluses, and then foreign sectors minus 3. The U.S. is in the opposite position. We're here, we're more like C. That's kind of the U.S. scenario in Goldilocks. Government budget deficit about 4% of GDP, private 1, foreign at 3. This is kind of where we were in 2018, 2019. That's kind of the Goldilocks U.S. Go ahead.
What would it
It's
take?
interesting you're pretending that Germany leeching off the world is a good thing.
It's good for them.
What would it take for us to get to that position? I mean, short of
being the world's reserve currency.
would that do it?
Now that's a good. Would you explain that? That is right, but I'm not sure how to explain that in the context of this model, and I will take that as a to-do because that's a good
Okay.
point.
If Germany is sucking money out of the world, where did it come from?
The rest of the world.
Yes.
Comes from
the rest of the world
dollars. Comes from dollars in the short term because we're the world's reserve currency. but those dollars might in turn come from elsewhere.
Well, okay. A dollar cannot come from anywhere else.
Ultimately,
It
it comes
absolutely
from us,
cannot.
but it could have. In the short term, it could be coming from Japan or France or any place else. Could it not?
Well, that just means we ran it earlier.
That's right.
So it still came from us.
I have to think about how that works, but you are correct. I've got to think about the mechanism. It works through trade, doesn't it? Through the trade deficit or surplus. If everybody wants dollars, they've got to buy. I'm trying to think about how that.
At some point, they got to buy U.S. goods.
Well, let me throw something in
but-
here. What dollars are we talking about? U.S. dollars? Are you talking about petrodollars? Is that something you want to consider? What kind of dollars are there? There might be more than one.
Oil is
I'm
traded
thinking
in
of
American
US
dollars.
Yes. But I remember reading it. She's right. I will take that as a to-do. I want to better understand it. Is yes, the world reserve currency for some reason means we have a trade deficit. And if we were not the world's reversed, we would not necessarily have as bad a trade deficit. So giving up that currency status might help us get there. But Paul, to your question, how do you go from being a C country here, kind of like this, to a country like Germany? I think you have to go through the foreign. You have to figure out a way to get your trade deficit or the foreign surplus down. The alternative way would be if you somehow can cut your budget deficit down to here, people don't have the money to buy imports with. That will cause this to drop also, but I don't think that is a viable strategy. I think you're going to have a nasty recession if you suddenly cut the budget deficit. But if you did, if you cut the budget deficit and you went like this, in theory, you did this, you would hope that you could get that foreign deficit to go down, but I wouldn't count on it. So I don't know if there's a way for us to get out of it. I don't think it's so horrible, though, to be at sea. Meaning if you have and maybe you narrow it a little, like this becomes -3 and this becomes 2, but as long as you're not running a crazy, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% of GDP budget deficit, you should be okay. The bad news is, as our country ages, that's what the CBO is thinking we're going to do. That this number is going to become 6, 7, 8, or 9, in which case we've got to figure out how do we balance that here? What's going to happen? And they don't see a good scenario, meaning they would see a private sector that drives this number way up and could cause a crash like we could have a repeat of this. Like if this were, let's say this is 2040, where the government's got a massive 10% of GDP deficit, the private sector is freaked out and is saving like crazy, that you could have look where we were here. We were in a terrible economic position. So I don't know what's going to happen there, how the government's going to fix that. But, being here at point C, where we were recently, isn't so bad. Yeah, being point E would be awesome. All right. I think we've hit this.
Not if you're Greece.
What's that? Yeah. That's probably what Greece looked like. Greece was probably going through this sort of scenario as well.
Does it make a difference on the income distribution?
Where does Japan in all this?
Excuse me.
Japan been in an aging population and
they're running
deficits for a long time?
Deficits.
They're running big budget deficits. And I think they have, where is Japan? Are they close to zero? They're not running a very big trade deficit, are they? I think their trade deficit is pretty close to zero. So it's the government and the private are probably going to look like a mirror image of each other, but they're surviving somehow. They're getting by, and I'm not exactly sure why. They have low unemployment. They seem to be doing okay. I'm not sure, but let's hope we are able to.
Does the income distribution in the private sector make a difference if you've got a wide disparity in income?
I don't know, but that's a good point. Maybe it does. It may help. I don't think Japan is as bad as we are in terms of their income inequality. They have more.
No, I don't think
more
they
than
are.
distributed. Yeah, I'll look at that. So those are a couple things. The world reserve currency and the income distribution and how that feeds into this is something I'm curious because I really like this model. I'm just getting my arms around it, and the implications of it are enormous. All right.
Welcome to MMT.
Yes, but it's one of those theories that is, it's not theory. I mean, the model is an equation that it is just part of the definition. So the interpretation requires some work. Let's talk quickly here about Biden's plan, and then I think we'll go to our post Oreo, what's the virtual Oreo session. So we haven't got legislation on this yet, is my understanding. Maybe the Biden infrastructure plan is not legislated yet, if I'm not mistaken. So it's his proposal at this stage. There is a gigantic, 50-page Americans Job Plan fact sheet, which is listed in the lower right. So you can learn more than you've ever wanted to know about this. There's also a summary from the CRFB, which is pretty handy as well. But what he's saying is the blue up in here is revenue that he's planning to get over 15 years from corporate tax hikes. And it actually is more over 15 years. It actually fully pays for, according to Biden, pays for the $2.6 trillion plan to invest in all these other areas that are down here. And it's what you would think of in traditional infrastructure: roads, bridges, ports, airports, water systems, electrical grid, broadband, clean water, quality housing. Last two probably stretching it a little bit. I think digital broadband is not a stretch for infrastructure, but maybe clean water, that's not either. Quality housing may be a stretch for infrastructure. Highway modernization, retrofitting homes and buildings, home-based care funding, meaning the idea of human infrastructure, helping people take those enormous costs of caring for elderly, fixing some of the largest bridges and 10,000 smaller bridges, Made in America incentives, and then also targeting some of this money to rural areas which are being left behind in the economy. I'll show you in a little bit a slide that shows you that the Biden won 70% of the GDP counties. I'm sorry. Yeah, counties that represent 70% of GDP, he won. So, the Republicans are attacking this, saying, "Oh, you're not. It's not really infrastructure. It's something else. It's a bunch of liberal wish lists." But these things don't look like just liberal things, and they're also very, very much. This is a very popular plan with Democrats and Republicans right now, and it's fully funded. So it's not a deficit increaser, assuming you not bend the rules, but you look at 15 years of revenue versus 10 years of spending. Just a little background on the taxes, on the corporate, the idea of, because Republicans are going to fight the corporate tax rate idea. Corporate tax rate is right now at 21%. That's the lowest it's been since World War II. There's a little bit of drama or complexity in that, and Carl might add to this about the Tax Reform Act of 1986, where Reagan did cut the rate, but he also got rid of some loopholes. So it wasn't a pure kind of straight up rate. Carl, do you want to talk about the 86 one a little bit?
No, I think that's right. And when Reagan first took office, his initial tax cuts cut the personal rates, but not the corporate rate. When he negotiated with Rostenkowski, bringing the top personal rate down to 28%, eliminating a lot of loopholes, they brought the corporate rate down, but not to 28%. And again, when they brought the personal rate down to 28%, that was the rate for capital gains. That was the rate for dividends. That was the rate for income of any type reported on the personal tax return.
Okay. Yep. Now the Tax Cut and Job Act, the TCJA, that's the Trump tax cuts, took it to 21. Biden is proposing bringing it back to 28. You've heard some noise from Joe Manchin of West Virginia, that he wants to go. He doesn't want to go above 25. That's they can negotiate that. But so in other words, corporate tax rates they're as low as they've been. They're not out of whack. And if he moves it back to 28, that's actually a halfway split. Republicans should still be happy they got a 7% net cut out of the Trump tax cuts. They won't be, but they should. Now, there is a worldwide race to the bottom on corporate tax rates. The United States has lowered its rate, but the rest of the world is too. So this compares for 2000 and 2020 on corporate tax rates. And this is why Janet Yellen was saying, you know, these developed country governments need to agree. We're going to stop doing this because it gives each country an advantage in trying to move corporate headquarters and businesses over there when they break ranks with this. And that's very hard to do. So she's going to try it, though, and we'll see. But, you know, the effect, when you look at the effect on the budget deficit, when you look at percent of GDP that's been collected in income tax revenue, it's at a historic low in the U.S. It's tied with 1983 or so. So it's not all time, but it's down there at the bottom of the range, 1% of GDP. Historical average is 2.1. And remember, 1% of GDP is about 200 billion. So in 2020, the government collected about 200 billion in tax revenue from corporations, federal income tax from corporations. It would be twice that if we got back to the historical average, a little more. So that's 200 billion reduction in our budget deficit. And as Carl mentioned, the budget deficit, if you take out all this noise for helping the economy in the crisis, it's around $1 trillion. So that would reduce the budget deficit by a fifth if we got back to the historical average of income tax receipts from corporations. All right. You probably saw in the news, large companies, there are a lot of large companies that don't pay federal income tax. So these are Fortune 500 companies that reported profit from 2018 to 2019 that did not pay taxes. They have various ways that they do this. And in some cases, the government gave them some special benefits or some special ways of doing that. 2017, they had some incentives. And then the CARES Act also gave them incentives. But still, this is why one of the things Biden is proposing, and I'm going to go up a second here, is this enact minimum book income tax, and then some other measures called stop corporate inversions and offshoring, which is where a company will pretend that it's earning its money in Ireland, which has a lower income, even though it's really earning the money in the United States or somewhere else, which has a much higher tax. Sorry, the tax rate is lower in Ireland, so they pretend that their profits are there and their revenues are there otherwise, and they get away with murder. And so it's not impossible for a good tax auditor to spot that, and they can do it. I don't have a slide on it in here, but there was a lot of interesting noise around just how much the rich are getting away with in terms of it's very difficult for the IRS to go after rich people. They know how to protect themselves, and they're estimating, I've seen estimates as high as $1 trillion a year in taxes that the IRS is not collecting because of ways that the rich people are sheltering themselves. So there's a lot that can be done through law enforcement, through IRS enforcing the laws before you even get to raising, say, income taxes. There's a lot of money that they can get from the rich if they go after them. And clearly, Trump wasn't about to empower the IRS during his regime. So I'm curious to see what Biden does with that. I mentioned earlier the Biden won counties that are 71% of GDP. So when you ask, do Democrats have a mandate? To what extent can Democrats push their policies? Well, the Democrats have 71% of GDP. Senate Democrats represent 42 million more people than Senate Republicans, mainly because you've got Democrats in California, to only 2 senators. And then you've got, I don't know how many other dozen of the small states it takes to add up to the population of California. But overall, there's 42 million more represented by Democratic senators. And remember, the two houses are 50-50 right now, so you can kind of do that measure. There's some polling. I think this is the last slide. Yeah, there's some polling on kind of how Democrats and Republicans are talking about what are their major concerns. And if you look in the lower right, the federal budget deficit is not a concern to Democrats, and it's a concern to Republicans, a very significant concern, one of the highest concerns to Republicans, along with illegal immigration, which is also not a big concern to Democrats. So those are 2 issues where there are widely different views. There are some others too, quite a few on here where there are widely different views. But I thought this right-hand graphic was a great slide about just how wide the differences in views are. And then also in several cases where the views are relatively closer together. Like Biden's in good shape probably on this infrastructure piece because the views are pretty similar. In fact, it looks like almost that, yeah. So it's not, you know, you can bridge those kinds of gaps, whereas you're not going to bridge a gun violence gap. You're probably not going to bridge an illegal immigration gap. And those are issues that are incredibly contentious. And if you're talking about those things, you're getting the Republicans amped up. Whereas if you're talking about some of these other topics, they're not going to get quite as excited. And over here is when you blend both parties kind of in the same graph. Healthcare is right at the top, which is good news for Democrats. But the budget deficit is one where it's just not something that's a priority, and Democrats have to explain why it's important to borrow the money that we're borrowing. Don't just ignore it, but you can't expect people to go through a lecture that I just gave you on does the budget deficit have to be at least as big as your trade deficit? You'll never get there. But you can use plainer language to explain that, you know, we're running a big budget deficit, and when the economy is healthy again, then we'll talk about, you know, tax hikes and spending cuts. But right now, priority is let's do infrastructure. And Biden, to his credit, has said, my infrastructure plan is paid for by tax hikes on corporations, and it's a very popular plan right now. So that's the end of our prepared stuff. I just had added a Twitter thread on the sector balances highlighted there. So if you want to see this on Twitter, if you ever need to reference it, you have it. Of course, you have this presentation as well. If you want to give your friends headaches, you can share that sector balance thing, but it's going to go over most people's head. It's hard enough to understand when you're hearing it from somebody that's thought about how to present it with all these slides. But you've got a lot of other ideas
David?
you can do. Yes.
The question that you had about Japan and their trade balance, et cetera, they had a $751 billion trade surplus this last year, 2020.
Wow.
So,
yep.
So that reversed a budget deficit a year earlier, 159 compared with a JPY of 159.
Okay, right. You're saying their budget deficit is pretty close to zero. Is that the budget deficit?
Well,
did I hear you right?
It said the trade surplus for 2020 was, and they call it a JPY, was 751 billion.
Japanese
yen. That Japanese yen would be JPY, Japanese yen. Okay. I don't remember how to translate that into GDP, but it sounds like so if they've got a surplus and their budget deficit is, I think it's still pretty big there, but if their budget deficit were, well, let's look at what we have. So if we have a surplus in their trade deficit, I don't have this as that is the Germany situation, kind of where they have a foreign, if they've got a trade surplus, that means the rest of the world is negative. So they've got a situation that's going to be like D or E or H, depending, these negatives in foreign. Remember, it's from now we're talking about Japan. It's the rest of the world relative to Japan. So if Japan's got a surplus, the rest of the world's in deficit, which is why that's negative. I would just need to know the other numbers. What we do know is if the foreign is negative, these other two have to add up to +3.
Well,
right?
They have a budget deficit, so it's negative. So therefore, their private sector has to be positive.
Right. They got a nice positive private sector surplus then if they're, okay. Yeah, because if this is minus, I don't know if we've got one that's even like that. Do we have one that's in that combination? I don't think I even have one like that. Nope. No. If they've got a minus here and they've got a, you say they do have a certain government deficit, or was it a surplus?
I think I understood they had a small, government deficit.
Small government deficit. So it'd be like -3, -1. This one would have to be +4.
Yeah.
I would like to see you do
some
comparisons between Japan and Germany. I mean, there's certain things that they're comparable. There's certain things that aren't, but.
If you can be a big export economy, you're going to look really good on these metrics because your blue line is going to be negative, and that allows your red line to be much closer towards zero. And if you still run a government a deficit, then you're going to have a nice private sector surplus. You want that private sector surplus, and having a trade deficit like the U.S. has makes it harder. If you've got a trade surplus like Japan and Germany have, then you can run a pretty small government deficit, or even have a surplus and still have a private sector surplus. I mean, that's a nice. This Germany is Goldilocks. The Germany's got this nice. You want to be at E. You can be here. You're rocking. Not
Okay,
realistic for
you
the
do
US,
know why Germany can run a surplus, right?
because everybody else has a deficit.
Exactly. How
Yeah,
did Germany
it's
pull
very
that
good
off?
for them.
Well, they're the
Created
biggest
the euro.
economy in Europe, right?
Well, no,
The
they
euro
created
helped
the
them.
euro.
Right. Yes, that did help them quite a bit.
Okay,
You want to explain that?
that's
I used
pretty
to be able to
funny.
explain that, but I can't anymore. I don't remember how to explain that in a good way. What's the right way to explain that one? If you're use
Within the
Greece
European
as an
Union,
example.
you cannot have a foreign exchange rate. So there's no way for Germany to float
right.
against France.
No, they don't.
Okay.
They're not the reserve
Right.
currency, but aren't they the biggest economy of the
There
European
the
Union?
euro is the reserve currency in Europe.
Yep.
Yeah. If you are, okay, let's talk about that a second. If you are Germany and you have, I'm not sure I can even go there.
But
Sorry.
Germany and
Apologize.
France sort
I will
of
be
run
quiet.
that.
Oh, here's what I was trying to say. If you're, okay, in theory, if you just have two countries just for a second, and one of them's in surplus, one of them's in deficit, in theory, the exchange rate is going to float and cancel that out. The country that has got and how's that going to work? The country that has got the trade surplus, its currency is going to appreciate. And it's going to become more expensive for them to export because their exports become more expensive, and that eliminates the trade deficit. Germany avoided that mechanism by having its whole trading area essentially become on the euro, so that it avoided the Deutsche Mark appreciating and making their exports so expensive that their trade surplus was wiped out. Did I explain that right? I think I did, Christine, sorry.
Yep.
I think that's how it works. You
Pretty
essentially
slick.
that's it. I will, let me add that to our list as well.
Good luck to Greece.
How Germany how Germany pulled off the.
Oh, by the
Germany
way,
benefit of the euro.
Alabama, is it Alabama or Mississippi? Mississippi is about as bad as Greece. Why don't we care?
Germany, okay. Yeah, the idea that exchange rates will equalize out a trade deficit, you would think that would be happening with the dollar, where the dollar would be getting less expensive so that our imports become more desirable, and our exports are becoming more desirable because the dollar is falling, and we would balance out our trade deficit because our exports increase to offset our imports. That is not happening. And I think that may be part of why that might be the world reserve currency plays into that. That mechanism of exchange rates canceling out the trade deficit over time just has not played out for the U.S. It should, in theory, play out among trading partners, but it certainly is not for Germany. And it looks like Japan has managed to be a net exporter too, at least recently. All right.
Oh, it's totally wild that for France to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, somehow they have to get dollars.
Yeah.
What does Japan do for their oil? Do they have to get dollars too?
Yes, they sell us lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they don't have any resources, so.
All right.
Fun stuff.
I wonder if that's not one of the reasons why why France has the huge number of nuclear power plants that they do. Save them from having to buy fuel.
Well, also they wanted to, they early on decided to avoid global warming. And so their carbon footprint per capita is about a third of what ours is in the US.
Doesn't their investment in nuclear power concerns? I think it goes back a long, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it goes back decades.
Yeah.
So David, where does China fit into that graph and chart?
I don't know. I would have to look it up because China, I thought that China, we have a big trade deficit with China. I mean, we have a big trade surplus with us. But I thought that China doesn't carry a very big trade deficit or surplus with the rest of the world. I think it's fairly, it levels out. So I'll look at it. I'll take a look and see where China is. I'll try to get a comparison of different big countries on the framework and see what they do.
Good luck
I'm
getting
really
real
curious to
numbers
see
for
what number
China.
you come up with.
It's a hard one to get. I can find it. I've seen it going back a few years, but there is such a comparison available, and it's something I could calculate because I only need to know two of the numbers to get the third, right? So I can plug the last one. If I can get the budget deficit and the trade deficit for the country, which is fairly straightforward, I can get the third number. One nice thing about three things that have to add up. If I know two of them, I know the third, and two of them are easy. So yeah, I think I can do that. I will.
Wasn't there an effort? Isn't there an effort by a number of countries to group together to replace the U.S. as the reserve currency?
Good luck.
Yeah. There's a reason why we're so nice to Saudi Arabia. Right?
Yeah, there was a proposal to create a basket of currencies, I thought, but that sounds like having the dual gold-silver standard problems.
Again, how do you do that? Germany absolutely does not want to inflate their currency.
What wasn't it? China, Brazil. Who else was it? It was India. China, Brazil, India, something.
Shall we go ahead and stop recording now and just continue discussion
Sure.
off the recording?